Welcome and thank you all for joining us today. It is an honor to stand before you at this important conference, marking a decade since the rise of Daesh and the devastation it caused across the Middle East and beyond. 10 years ago, on a day like this, Daesh was dismantling life in cities like Mosul, Raqqa, and other cities. I witnessed the destruction firsthand, with only one pen as a weapon, to document the horrors and keep the world informed. Today, we are here not only to reflect on that dark period, but to discuss the critical lessons learned so that we can prevent such terrorism from happening again in the future. First and foremost, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, the Global Coalition Against Daesh, and the British Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office's Counter-Daesh Communication Cell, namely Martin and Paul, for their unwavering support in making this conference possible. Your efforts have been indispensable in bringing together experts, policymakers, and scholars worldwide to address the ongoing challenges of terrorism. I would also like to recognize the vital contributions of the members of the Global Coalition. Their active involvement and commitment have been instrumental in the fight against Daesh, particularly in stabilizing the region and supporting efforts to counter the spread of extremist ideologies. In addition to the critical role played by governments and military forces, the contributions of academics over the past decade have been invaluable. Scholars worldwide have dedicated their work to deepening our understanding of terrorism, the factors that drive it, and the most effective ways to counter it. Their research has helped shape the policies and strategies that guide our responses to extremism, and their insights have shed light on the complex ideological, financial, and social dimensions of terrorist organizations like Daesh. Today, we are not simply here to have a look back, but to learn. This conference provides a platform for discussing the lessons of the past decade and exploring how we can apply those lessons to prevent the resurgence of terrorism in the future. We have seen the damage that groups like Daesh can inflict on societies. Still, we have also witnessed the resilience of individuals and communities and the strength of international cooperation in the face of such challenges. Through this collaboration, the Program on Extremism at the George Washington University aims to foster a space where policymakers and scholars can collaborate to share ideas, collaborate on research, and develop practical solutions. We hope that by building stronger bridges between the academic and policy worlds, we can contribute to improve our understanding of terrorism and develop more effective strategies to combat it. However, the fight against terrorism is not over yet, and the threats we face continue to evolve. But by working together across borders, disciplines, and sectors, we can ensure that our progress over the past decade is not lost. We must remain vigilant, adaptable, and committed to the shared goal of preventing extremism from taking root in our societies once again. Thank you for being here, and for the scholars for their dedication in providing and contributing to the critical discussions that we will follow. I look forward to the valuable insights and collaborations that will emerge from this conference. And I would like to invite Her Excellency Sheikh Al-Anud Ibrahim Al-Khalifa, First Secretary of the Embassy of the Kingdom of Bahrain to the United Kingdom, to give their remarks. Thank you. Please.
Thank you, Omar. It is my great pleasure to represent the Embassy of the Kingdom of Bahrain, and I want to thank the host for their generous invitation. This panel is a chance for us to review achievements over the past decade in countering Daesh and to analyze how to move forward most effectively in facing threats from extremist and terrorist groups and their ideologies. It is also an opportunity to share Bahrain's experience and efforts in its holistic approach to countering extremist ideologies and terrorism. Our experience in Bahrain has mainly been as the target of terrorism, in particular from foreign-backed groups. And as a cross-border challenge, we are working with our partners in GCC and internationally. We are active members of the Global Coalition Against Daesh and a leading member of the Financial Action Task Force with the MENA FAT established in Manama in 2004. Meanwhile, our anti-money laundering system achievements have been recognized worldwide. This is a result of our awareness that financial means is one of the critical lures used by terrorists to gain recruits. We studied the root causes of the extremist ideologies that led to around 40 Bahrainis to join Daesh, and it was mainly from two families and their associates at the peak of the Syrian civil war. And considering Bahrain's 1.5 million population, this number is considered low compared to other countries. But as ideology spread so quickly, we took this threat very, very seriously. And we have implemented, as a result, a comprehensive regulatory approach in critical sectors. For example, we realized that religious speeches are one of the main tools used by terrorists. In this context, Bahrain government worked on a set of laws to combat hate speech based on religion or belief. The implementation process focused on raising awareness about religious freedom and spreading a culture of tolerance and religious coexistence in society via religious platforms and the media, in addition to criminalizing incitement of hatred, sectarianism, extremism, and terrorism. On the other hand, donations and charities have been regulated, and my country was the first country in the region to regulate donations and implement financial regulations on all charities under one umbrella, one organization, which is the Royal Humanitarian Foundation. We have also been proactive, for example, in establishing the King Hamad Global Center for Peaceful Coexistence and the King Hamad Chair in Interfaith Dialogue and Peaceful Coexistence at the Italian University of Spienza in 2018. This represents the government work with extensive inter-agency cooperation to enhance preventive and proactive work through several specialized programs and regulations that protect our people, and especially young people, from the threats of extremism and violence they may encounter on platforms such as social media and traditional media. For example, we have an initiative called Ma'an, which means together, and the anti-extremism curriculum aims to strengthen social cohesion, alert young people to the dangers of extremism and intolerance. Extremism feeds on conflicts and thrives in a vacuum, whether it's a vacuum of power, institutions, or knowledge. Ample evidence is the conflicts in Syria, Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan, that resulted in a massive number of displaced people living in refugee camps who are often targeted as potential recruits. And acknowledging that, Bahrain has provided education projects at Syrian refugee camps accommodating over 900 students, and the school has a library, a science lab, 2 computer labs, and teachers' offices. And my country also built hospitals and 3,000 housing units and donated over $20 million to the Syrian refugee cause. Ladies and gentlemen, Bahrain's experience in tackling extremism on the ground has convinced us that a successful strategy must be truly comprehensive. That is why we have combined the hard and soft approaches to tackling terrorism and extremism to create an effective strategy that we believe can serve as a model for others. I welcome this opportunity to share these and other experiences with you, to exchange and learn from the distinguished panelists' expertise, and I hope we can develop ideas that build on our successes in countering terrorism comprehensively and effectively. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like now to invite Martin from the Foreign Office to give his remarks.
Omar. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for organising this event. Thank you for coming. It's an important year and it's an important topic to talk about. But before I say anything else, I want to pay tribute. I want to pay tribute to this man. This man has shown extraordinary courage and bravery and passion over the last decade to defeating the barbarism of Daesh. At huge personal cost and danger, he has done that in a way that I suspect not anybody else in this room, forgive me, don't know that this is the case, but I suspect nobody else in this room has quite had to do that, and he has done it. So if I may ask you, a great inspiration to me whilst I was in northern Iraq and since coming back from Iraq. So if I may ask you to applaud Omar. Let me carry on by saying who I am. I'm a career diplomat working in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. I spent most of my time in the Middle East, handling conflict and eventually countering terrorism. I was, as I mentioned, in northern Iraq at the time of the liberation of Mosul and the territorial defeat of Daesh. It's quite an experience. I'm now head of the counter-Daesh communications cell based in the FCDO, and I took that job specifically, or I rather applied for that job specifically, because I definitely felt on leaving Iraq that there was unfinished business, and isn't that the case, notwithstanding the successes that have been achieved. The cell runs the coalition's communications campaigns to undercut Daesh's propaganda. Today I'm going to talk briefly, because the best bits are definitely interchanged between the audience and the panel, about the successes of the coalition, the challenges that I think it now still faces, and how it might meet those challenges, including beyond the battlefield, because that is a terribly important point, both in Iraq and Syria, but elsewhere in the world. I should emphasize that I'm speaking more in a personal capacity than an official capacity. It's how I see things. So what might we say that I think the coalition has achieved in the last 10 years? I'd say quite a lot, a great deal in fact. The number of Daesh attacks and the volume of Daesh's propaganda worldwide has radically fallen over the last 10 years, certainly since 2017. Its finances are probably the weakest that they have ever been. In Iraq, the coalition stopped Daesh driving into Baghdad and Erbil. It would, I think, have been a shocking moment for one of the iconic capitals of the Middle East to fall into a medieval force in pickups, because that's how it appeared first to most communities in Iraq and Syria at the time. But within 5 years, the coalition had regained all of the huge swathes of territory that Daesh had occupied in Iraq and Syria, undid the caliphate physically, and reduced Daesh from an occupying force to a bare bones operation. The coalition liberated millions of Iraqis and Syrians from barbarism and provided billions of dollars worth of humanitarian and reconstruction assistance so that they could rebuild their lives over the period. In Iraq, the conversation now is no longer about Daesh and whether it represents an existential threat to the state. The coalition has also weakened Daesh by repeatedly taking out its leaders and undermining the appeal of its propaganda, and building the capability of indigenous forces, as we saw last week, to continue to bear down on Daesh within Iraq and to a certain extent in Syria. I think in short, the coalition can claim to have been a success. The coalition didn't do this all alone. Let's just not get carried away on this part. On the ground, it was Iraqis and Syrians who defeated Daesh as well, and lost many soldiers and civilians in the process. But I think it's fair to say, and I'd be interested in views on this, that without the coalition, those forces might not have been sufficiently confident or capable to achieve what they have, certainly not so quickly. And I think in answering the question, what has the coalition achieved, it's worth asking ourselves what the Middle East might look like if the coalition had not been formed. It's not inevitable that Iraq alone would have been able to wrestle back its country any more than it proved inevitable that Iraqi forces in 2013 and 14 were able to stop Daesh in the first place. That did not happen. It's worth remembering that point. So would much of Syria and Iraq still be an Islamic state without the formation of the coalition? And what would the consequences be now for the region, in Africa, Asia, and the West, if that were the case? I think we could assume it would have brought many, many more terror attacks and deaths worldwide. And if the coalition had not been formed in 2014, would it be formed now, or even after, let's say, 2017? As administrations changed, as the politics of the world changed really quite dramatically, as COVID hit us, and so on and so on. I actually think not. We're living now in a much more contested and fragmented world in which transnational threats are growing of all sorts. But transnational responses are harder and harder to mount. Would it be possible to form a global coalition against Daesh now? Not so sure. The competition for the necessary attention, political will and resource much greater now than 10 years ago, or even 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. We've had COVID, we've had Putin's invasion of Ukraine, we've had the 7th of October and its aftermath. The work against Daesh is competing against these issues all the time. So I think the coalition has a lot to be proud of. It's a unique, essentially voluntary organization, body, from a particular moment in time, except that that time continues. So whilst I think the coalition has been successful, that success needs reinforcing and reinforcing. Why? I'll be brief here, because I think others are going to cover it in more detail. Because Daesh is on the up again. In Iraq and Syria, Daesh, as we say, is down but not out, as we saw only last week in Iraq. Iraqi forces on top of them, but the coalition's assistance is still needed for a while yet to keep the lid on Daesh longer term. The transition of the military operation of the coalition, what we call CJTFOIR, Operation Inherent Resolve in Iraq and Syria, needs to be managed carefully over the next few years so that Daesh does not resurge. Syria, it's a terrible mess for all of the reasons that I think we know. Yes, Daesh does not hold territory as such, but it holds huge sway in large parts of Syria, particularly in certain deserts. And the undercurrent of support that we monitor on a regular basis is pretty frightening, particularly in certain provinces. It's not enough, it is, that provides Daesh with an opportunity that is still there and can still be exploited in what is a chaotic security situation that could become even more chaotic over the next few years. And we have the prisons and the camps. One of my colleagues who knows more about this than I do thinks the prisons and the camps is the strategic threat to the countering of Daesh over the next decade. I have no reason, I get that, I have no reason to challenge that. We've got 9,000 hardened Daesh fighters in prisons who have a terrible potential to fight if they are in any way freed by whoever. And we have 20,000 plus children in our whole camp and other camps that who, if not removed and supported, will be radicalized to a degree in some fashion over time. Elsewhere, we have ISKP projecting its threat into regional states and Europe, as we saw over the summer. If you are a Swiftie, you will know what I'm talking about. More effectively and quicker than we feared when NATO came out of Afghanistan a little while ago. In Africa, every month I read that the continent is now the epicenter of global terrorism, and the figures are shocking and frightening. And then there's the radicalizing effect of the 7th of October and its aftermath. I agree with analysts who think that the events in Gaza represent what might be called a generational moment. and the consequences never really leave us. My fear is that events in Gaza are, and perhaps elsewhere now, are blurring the lines between terrorism, violent extremism, non-violent extremism, and responsible objection. I think we see that in Britain and elsewhere. So what might we do about this? I think that the coalition still has a pivotal role to play in countering the renewed threat of international terrorism and violent extremism, and for the foreseeable future. Whether it's a decade or what, I'm not going to put a time scale on it. I think it needs to persist, whatever that time scale is. How? I offer 4 thoughts. First, the coalition could start by recognizing its own successes. It needs to be a little more assertive, if I may say so, as somebody within it, in the battle for resources, time, and attention. It's an example of global mobilization that has worked in practice, and that's not usual. That's quite a rare achievement. Second, the coalition might capture the many lessons it's learned over the last decade in facing the next few years. The tasks it faces are very different, but I wonder whether they're as different as sometimes we make out. If you look at them carefully, they essentially come down to very similar issues and similar root causes. And we've learned an awful lot about them. We've learned an awful lot about Daesh, who and what they are and how they operate, and other terror groups. We need to apply that and stop imagining that we're starting from scratch. Corporate memory in government is not great. We need to hold on to it. Third, we also need to be clear about the value of integrating our responses. Speaking to the point about beyond the battlefield. Yes, there's a kinetic angle to the countering of Daesh, but it is much more than that. To adopt what I call a whole-of-government response, beyond the battlefield, integrating CT, CVE, conflict and development resources, policies, and know-how. The fourth, it's a little bit internal, a thought, coalition really needs to restructure itself. Frankly, to mirror what Daesh does. Daesh operates on a regional basis, by wilayat, by province. The coalition is currently structured along thematic lines. So we have communications, we have the military bit, we have the countering finance, we have stabilization. It's hard work to connect these things in a way that Daesh does really quite organically. We need, curiously, to follow the example set by Daesh. A regional approach could also help coalition members who are victims of Daesh and who need a lot of support and don't have the resources to counter what is often a huge internal conflict, don't have the resources to do that. It'll help them to integrate and be supported by the external members of Daesh. All that, I think, would increase the effectiveness of the coalition's interventions and improve value for money. Value for money is a very big matter in a resource extractive environment. That is the case in Britain and elsewhere within the coalition. Act locally and project globally. That's what Daesh does, and well, we could do the same and better. I'll close by suggesting that it's a bit of an intriguing thought that Daesh might hold some of the answers to how the global coalition against Daesh might succeed in its second decade, as I think it has in its first. Thank you very much.
Alice, please.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. My name is Alexander Malegri-Richards. I'm the co-director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. Omar asked me to give a couple of comments on the research of both our center here and the program on extremism, particularly over the last 10 years in advancing sort of academic research and knowledge on terrorism, particularly the rise of ISIS. Of course, academic research in terrorism in general has advanced a lot over the last decade, especially. Particularly, access to primary sources has really exploded, for want of a better term. Particularly digital, online access to sources. You know, this was a big problem for terrorism studies for a long time. that's really changed. So a lot of researchers have access to a lot more today online and on the ground. The methods for applying and using this data have also advanced, and we'll hear a bit about that today. And our two centers, ICSR and the Program on Extremism, have made some significant contributions in this regard. Program on Extremism has pioneered the use of primary source, access to court data to understand the ISIS presence in America. They've also hosted the ISIS Files project, which is captured ISIS documents that are not publicly available for people to research. ICSR as well has led the way on the use of online data to map and analyze Western foreign fighter involvement in Iraq and Syria. We're also a key partner of an FCDO-backed project called Accept, which draws on a vast network of both on-the-ground, local, and international researchers who use mixed methods and sources, including on-the-ground surveys from conflicts and post-conflict environments like Iraq and Sudan, to better understand those environments, better understand the factors that shape violent and peaceful behavior. And another project we run, which will be discussed in detail on the panel, relates also to something that Martin brought up, which is the detainee's dilemma and the challenge of how to deal with that. That remains also a sort of, alongside things like October 7th, an increasingly important radicalizing factor for Western jihadists who online are actually in contact with some of these prisoners through a lot of these platforms, and you can actually watch this stuff happen in real time. Very interesting. So I will leave it at that, just to quickly introduce those of our panel who haven't yet spoken. Sergio Altuna, who is a senior researcher at the Program on Extremism, he's actually going to give us a quick 15-minute presentation at the beginning on the POE Jihadist Narratives Analysis Project. We'll also hear from the panel from Hugo Micheron from Sciences Po, and Shiraz Meir, my colleague here as co-director at ICSR. And I will leave it at that. Sergio, go ahead, thank you.
Sorry for the light show. We were checking ahead of time that everything worked well, and the slides were a bit too bright to be seen, so just for a brief explanation. I'd like to extend my gratitude to ICSR and the Global Coalition of the Foreign Affairs, Commonwealth and Development Office for co-hosting this event today. It is really an honor to be here as we reflect on a decade already of efforts to combat Daesh and other global jihadist organizations, and to consider some of the strategic challenges ahead. Sorry, following Mr. Orr's example, I think it's a good idea to introduce myself. Other than being a senior researcher at the Program on Extremism at George Washington University back in the past, almost 20 years back in the past, I used to be a specialist in linguistics, and I used to own a translation and linguistic services company, which I think will be explained. There's two hats I own. It will be explained through the presentation, because as you can see, we'd like to introduce our new project, which we've named Titan. This is, by the way, a premiere. It will be officially launched by the end of the year, or very early in 2025. A project we have, we think, really very, very ambitious project regarding what we're going to see approaching from another point of view, jihadist narratives and jihadist discourse. So what is Titan going to be? I mean, other than saying the classic, innovative, groundbreaking, that is going to be definitely scientific, we're going to approach narratives from Arabic language. And those of you not familiar with Arabic, it has really been the barrier when it comes to use mixed methods on jihadist discourse. Just for you to have some piece of statistics and data, 81%, 81 and 82% of official jihadist propaganda is in Arabic language, which is not accessible to everybody. Other than that, Arabic does present or does come with some technology-related challenges that might not be familiar for those English speakers in this case, which are basically the use of technology over Arabic language. When it comes, for example, this project, which is going to be based on the exploitation of or the compilation, codification, and later, of course, exploitation of a monolingual, balanced, and representative corpus, which, of course, is a collection of texts that can be machine readable. Probably most of you are familiar with what a corpus is. The thing is, if you look for a corpus in Arabic, there's very few examples because we were not able to exploit it in the way Latin alphabet-based languages work. Well, it's a bit of a too nerdy explanation. So, why studying narratives? Again, I mean, there's a lot of added value you'll see. Of course, it's an understudied subject. Most of the scientific and academic works that I have approached the thing from either a quantitative point of view or either just targeting English propaganda emanating from this jihadist global organization, which of course is always targeting, or mostly targeting, the West. We're trying to offer empirical results. We're trying, of course, to provide analysis from a quantitative and a qualitative point of view, which mixed methods, with the aim of expanding knowledges and our knowledge in several areas like communication strategy, propaganda, and of course ideology. So basically, how does the project work? We have started to compile official documents both from Al-Qaeda and Daesh, but we've also been working with other organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah. By the way, just a disclaimer, all the data you're going to see is based of some primary work we did working basically on Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, just as a starting point because we had all the official data available. So basically, the time project works like this. There's of course some compilation criteria regarding which documents are eligible to be part of the project. Of course, there's a document check. There's a whole team, reading, listening, and viewing, in case of video, the documents. There's a transcription phase where the video and audio files become text, of course. And there's first, second, and third coding layers. I'll just drag you by that right. And of course, the corpus exploitation. Basically, the coding levels come like this. There's a document level to access or everything regarding metadata like date, author, source, who produced that, just for contextual information. Then there's a textual level which focuses on linguistic, rhetorical structure and identifies, of course, everything in Arabic, by the way, of course, I mentioned at the beginning. Key linguistic markers, repeated syntax patterns, etc. And a thematic level with design based, of course, not only on our document, but also all the researchers, namely, as I mentioned before, the ICSR and their excellent work. There's a thematic level based on a hierarchical list of categories of subcategories, which basically, before exploiting it, looks like this. This is just to track all documents and see who produced it, how long is it, etc., etc. And this is when all the pieces of software come in. Of course, the challenge was not only at using a piece of software that can recognize Arabic, which is already very challenging, but one that can be tweaked and can be reprogrammed to work the way Arabic works. For those of you not familiar, just ask some acquaintance of yours how an Arabic dictionary works. Because if you look for a word, you might only find this word and not other related words that are built in different ways, but in the end are linked to the same idea. Well, we have this textual and thematic coding. You can see that, well, in colors in green and blue. I don't know if that's visible. An ayah of the Quran that was incomplete. Well, of course, the program tracks every time, following our instructions, that the Quran is quoted or a hadith are quoted. If they're quoted exactly how the Quran or the Sahih hadith are, if not, and all the categories of the text. And I think probably the most interesting part of the presentation is going to be visualizing the results. Results that can typically be challenged because they're based on a corpus that covers all official propaganda products by a same or two organizations. So basically, of course, it's not only you can get how many times you can get a hit on a corpus, but I mean how important that term is when it comes to the full representation of it. Just, I don't know if I have the, I do, yeah, this, I've forgotten the name, this stars, I forgot the name in English, represented as part of our coding layer, when instead just of giving you Khilafa, let's say the caliphate, as a target, it will give you El Khilafa, it will give you all the related words from the same linguistic tree. When it comes to concordance, we can see not only the word in context and how do sentences that include these words are formed, if they have the same structure, if they have been produced by the same person, same writer, based on patterns, but also how often do they appear in the corpus, in a set of the corpus, say only audio files, say only video files, if they usually come at the beginning of the document, of the text, which came from an audio, video, text file, in the middle, in the end, what words, what concepts do come together with these. I mean, the exploitation really are limitless. Of course, we have the ability, this is very easy, to create word clouds, I believe they're called, also attending to regarding thematic categories, etc. Very important. Also, which narrative categories are more important regarding the nature of the text, if it's essays, if it's audios, if it's videos. Here you can see very clearly that usually ideology-based content, of course the category ideology is very broad, you'll see right now, has a bigger impact in those essays, in those books, in those products targeting an already convinced audience, whereas pure violence usually appears on videos, etc., etc. More regarding this, just to give you an example of what the textual coding layer can provide, just a very brief example of the hundreds we can make. This just, for example, tracks how many times did Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb in this case quote the Quran per year. But not only that, how many times of those they quote the Quran, they did quote ayat, so an incomplete ayat, which, for those of you that don't know, goes a bit contrary to what's ijma', what it's the commonly accepted by Muslims. So, as you may see, basically some of the results that we can provide say that at least 53%, if we take the whole sample, of the times they quote the Quran, they do it on a say, a wrong way. Also, we can of course see if they quote ayat Quraniya or ayat Makkiya or ayat Madaniya, if they always quote a violent ayat, if they, I mean, you name it. These are heat maps, just again to give you a brief idea of the power, of the impact that this project can have. This is an Akwin heat map from 2013 and 2014 when Daesh erupted, and how dramatically their production changed from a pretty balanced, let's say, structure regarding ideology, the enemy, victimism, and a whole bunch of categories we've coded our program to identify, to 2014, where ideology becomes very important to differentiate themselves from Daesh, whereas violence compared to a more violent and more visually violent organization diminished, with the goal probably to try to keep their audience and their fellow peers on the same path. What else? Of course, this kind of data visualization products try to track what features of their ideology, of their reaffirmation of belief, of their identity have an important or a greater impact in the discourse. So of course, as jihadi organization, jihadi and everything related to the duty, they perceive the duty is very important, but then we have a whole set of categories, and we can, of course, reprogram our software, our 2-3 tools to say if Sharia is very important, or set of documents during a set of years, if it's maybe hijrah, because they are trying to push people to travel to a certain region, of course, all features that that amount to what we believe describes the ideology of one of these groups. Also, on a set of documents, how often do these documents include Quranic quotes, ahadith, or exegesis, or dua, or how many documents come without any religious mention, if I may say. Anyway, the exploitation possibilities, I didn't want to give a very long talk, and I hope it fit the 10-15 minutes I was given. Really, I mean, we're provided, or we're able, we are weaponized to provide really a great deal of explanation, empirically speaking, to a limited number of queries. From very creative approaches, like if there's a causal relation between threats and attacks in a given year, in a set of years, in an organization, compared with another organization, the evolution of certain contexts through time. Is Tamkeen important now? Are they focusing on Tamkeen maybe in the Sahel because they're preparing maybe to storm a city, to occupy a city, to establish what they believe is the right system in a city? To identify, of course, the speaker or the writer according to a given structure of the discourse, to know who's producing the documents, to see if it's the same person, not the same person, according to conditions. Of course, it allows us to make comparative studies between different organizations and even different branches of the same organization. See, for example, if Al-Qaeda in the Islamic State, in the Islamic Maghreb, is giving a lot of importance to martyrdom operations, to kamikaze operations, or compared to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, this is not the case. And why? Provide explanation. And what's more important, we're really ready to approach again counter-narrative, or the understanding of narrative and counter-narrative from the right point. Because you may agree or not with me, countering extremism has gone through different phases in which different concepts were important: CVE, PVE, de-radicalization. And we want to, we need to invest in counter-narrative. We need to invest in narratives. But were we ready to really understand, to really exploit, to really make a tool out of our knowledge, to provide policymakers, to provide academia, to provide security forces with perspective analysis, with the real tools to combat the discourse? One needs to understand terrorist discourse to a very high degree in order to provide practitioners, imams, governments with the right tools to tackle extremism. I hope really that you follow the progress of this project. We will be publishing a lot of pieces from the beginning again of 2025, so I hope this proves useful for the whole academic community. We're also ready, as I said, to work with other partners, and I thank you very much for your attention.
I think we start our panel now. Martin, if you don't mind, I'd like to want to begin. I will be moderating this panel, and I think I will go first with Shiraz. Probably Shiraz. If you give us your remarks on the past 10 years, but where are we now?
Thank you very much, Omar. Thank you to everyone involved with organising this. Thanks to all of you for attending. And let me just say it's great to see a lot of MA students in the room as well. So we've been asked to just give some quick overview remarks. I'll speak about 4 I's that I see in this context: internationalism, IDPs, ideology, and innovation. And the idea is we'll just kick this off quickly to get into the main part of the discussion. We've heard a lot, and it's obviously well established and true. ISIS has both ongoing presence in its core area of activity in the Levant, in Syria and Iraq, as well as a sophisticated international presence in Africa, Asia as well. We can see a sort of ongoing level of low-grade activity in core areas of ISIS activity, as I say, in Syria and Iraq, in Raqqa, in Deir ez-Zor, and in Homs, with a number of significant attacks. And there was, at the end of August, a pretty huge and significant counter-terrorism operation, which was coordinated by both Iraqi and American forces against ISIS operatives in Iraq. Again, giving a sense of scale to the extent of which this group remains relevant and active. It's worth stating, though, that despite all of this, even the international affiliates have broadly localized goals. So even ISK wants to, despite its international ability to grab attention, its primary goal is still to undermine and to capitalize on fissures within the Taliban. It wants to and has ambition to establish itself and grow its sphere of influence, first and foremost within Afghanistan. That's despite things like the Taylor Swift aborted attack that was mentioned earlier today. In that international context, it's already been mentioned, but I think it's really important to note, of course, things such as the October 7th attacks and the ongoing conflict arising as a result of that have been a huge boon to groups like ISIS, but certainly not limited to it. And this serves ISIS in a number of different ways. The first is that the United States, which is obviously highly present in the region, is distracted. It has limited resources like everyone else, and therefore is having to spread itself between commitments to Israel. It's also facing increased threat in theaters like Iraq from Hezbollah and in Syria, and is having to look at those threats. And of course, the prospect of direct confrontation, which remains looming between Israel and Iran, will again divert resource, time, attention, and money from the United States in that context. It is also, of course, the kind of conflict that traditionally transcends partisanship. So, in the sense that groups like Al-Qaeda and others have traditionally condemned Hamas, called it an apostate movement, criticized it for things that it's doing. In this context now, where there's open conflict happening between these groups, they tend to shelve that partisanship in view of going after the bigger enemy, as it were, which again, in this context, is focusing on conflict against Israel. ISIS has not gone as far as Al-Qaeda in terms of eulogizing, praising Sinwar, Ismail Haniyeh, and others, calling them martyrs and so on. Nonetheless, it is seeking to operate within that space. You've seen a notable uptick in terms of its own output, talking about October the 7th, talking about Palestine more generally, and trying to rally their supporters in that gap. And of course, that would be an open goal for them to not try and exploit that broad anger and animus which is resulting as a rise of that. ISIS still also maintains a significant financial economy of its own. Latest DoD assessment suggests it has access to anywhere between 10 and 20 million dollars today. And so in that context, the ability to, I suppose, contain the rump of what remains of ISIS in its primary arena of activity is dependent on the ongoing presence of the coalition and of the United States. And again, it's worth saying, there's a US election looming just a matter of days away. This could have an impact on where we go. And we've seen, I'm sure, contradictory reports in the press about the State Department and DoD's thinking about what might happen over the next few years in terms of an ongoing US military presence in both Syria and Iraq. It's worth saying any diminishing of that presence will have significant and real consequences. So that's the local, the international aspect. One final point I was going to make on that before I go to the other point, which is it's useful to think about how important certain issues are that transcend the partisanship. The jihadist movement is deeply divided, except on certain issues. So if you think back to the time when both ISIS and Al-Qaeda were fighting each other in the context of the Syrian conflict, when the Charlie Hebdo attacks took place in Paris, ostensibly ascribed to Al-Qaeda, the guys who were walking through the street shouting, "We have avenged the Prophet," even ISIS had to praise that attack. It couldn't be seen to be sitting out something of that scale, which was seen as a defense of the Prophet within that world, despite their animus and animosity towards Al-Qaeda. So Israel has that same issue that transcends the traditional partisanship that exists between these groups. This leads me to the broader point then of the internally displaced persons, and Alex mentioned this is a big project that ICSR has been working on, that I've personally been working on, looking at the ongoing detention of tens of thousands of people affiliated or associated in one way or another with ISIS who are detained in northeastern Syria. The scale of what is transpiring up there is staggering. I was looking this morning just to get the very latest figures that I could see from official sources. And according to these, just taking Al-Hol, the main facility that's detaining women and children, there are 22,500 people under the age of 18 being detained there as of the most recent assessment. 2,500 of them are below the age of 5. These children have been there pretty much all of their lives, or for at least some of the most substantive formative periods of their lives. As we've already heard, there is no off-ramping for these children. There is no removal of these children from these facilities. If there's no broader package of care and rehabilitation and education and opportunity, what do you think happens? This speaks to the generational aspect of what we are facing, and it speaks to that broader sense that we tend to think in pretty kinetic terms about these conflicts. It is attractive and easy to say we defeated the territorial caliphate. We did. Military action, kinetic activity can only speak to that one aspect of what ISIS was, which was it was a proto-state that held territory and attempted to govern. But it remains an insurgency. It remains a terrorist movement. Those two aspects of its identity, although degraded, remain prominent and active today. It's worth saying as well, we talk about Al-Hol, it's the most dramatic and obvious, but there is a sprawling network of 27 different separate detention facilities in the northeast, in which, as is already mentioned again, there are about 10,000 men who have pretty much all been fighting in one form or another. 6,500 of the people in Al-Hol, and the substantial population, are third country nationals. But that brings us to this next point, which is this is primarily a problem of Syria and Iraq. The crisis is a Syrian crisis. It's an Iraqi crisis. These are two countries that require and will need our ongoing support to ensure that there is no recidivism of these nationals who are their nationals. In countries, particularly in the case of Iraq, particularly in the case of Syria, which is now not just a failed state, but increasingly a narco state as well. Which brings me to the third point of ideology. Underlying issues which gave rise to not just the Syrian uprising, but to the rise of ISIS, which allowed it to take root in so many places, have only been exacerbated. The areas in which ISIS primarily was able to establish itself were the areas of the vulnerable Sunni poor. These areas today have a real lack of opportunity, of economic opportunity, of education, of physical insecurity, of food insecurity. And so, in those contexts, part of the discussions that we've been having on the Track 2 dialogue that ICSR has run with government officials and NGOs and others working on the ground, where if you were to open the doors to Al-Hol tomorrow, not everybody would leave. In some respects, it's the more attractive place to be. Despite how bad it is, your home in Raqqa, your neighborhood in Raqqa may not be standing. There's nothing there. At least in Al-Hol, you've got a tent and some access to water. So, even in this context, you have to look at how we are going to manage and bring down and mitigate the crisis that people are facing in this environment. If you forgive me for making a related and perhaps touchy political point to this, but the Arab League has gained nothing by the normalization of relations with Assad, which is also a source of anguish for many people in the region. Leads me to the final point of innovation, and then I'll pass over to my colleagues, which is groups like ISIS have always been at the forefront of innovating. We've seen a great level of investment in malevolent creativity in order to further their objectives. There are a number of camps that they continue to maintain, again in the Syrian deserts, where they are looking at ways to continue to innovate technologically. We've seen them, again, at the forefront of developing weaponization of commercial drones and these types of things, but most recently using AI to spread propaganda in the aftermath of October 7th, not related specifically to that attack, but to talk about its own activities through this AI-generated news harvest, as they called it, to further connect with their audiences around the world. And you can see the interconnectedness then of all of these things as increased interest in accessing jihadist content, again, in understanding their worldview, their analysis of events, and they are seeking to deploy and develop their new technologies in that context. So those were the big areas I want to talk about online.
Thank you, Shiraz. And I have many questions I will get back to you. But I think, as you mentioned, and you mentioned the battlefield, you mentioned the consequences of that period. But I think, as I am giving the floor now to Hugo, I think 10 years ago, when Daesh began using the internet, I'm not sure any government or any research institute had any tools to respond. They had a full presence online, they even recruited many people online, but 10 years after that, and this is to you, Hugo, do we have the tools now?
Thank you very much, Omar. Thank you for organizing these great events. I'm delighted to be here. I'll straightforwardly answer to your question. We start to build the tools. We have a great example with Titan that was presented by Sergio. I myself with a team of researchers at Sciences Po and French CNRS, we developed an AI tool that is called Arlequin, or the Human Data Explorer, UDEX, which allows us to analyze massive data sets, very complex data sets in a few seconds, and then to sort of extract the meanings out of harmful narratives, which basically enable any experts to provide a diagnostic very sharp and very rapidly, and therefore which is very useful to document ongoing crisis or ongoing attempts from groups such as Daesh or other jihadi groups to spread their ideologies. And if you don't mind, I would like to explain why I ended up doing AI, because I'm not at all a tech expert in the first place. I spent actually the past 12 years working on the field, doing fieldwork research for Sciences Po and the ENS and Princeton University. My angle in the first place was European jihadism. I had the chance to study in Arabic in Syria before the war, and then when I came back in Europe, was here at King's College. I'm very proud to be a King's College graduate. It was in 2011, and the Arab Spring started, and everything unfolded from there, especially the destruction of Syria, and so I started to get interested in these dynamics, which brought me in France quite by chance to end up meeting some people who were leaving France to join ISIS and Al-Qaeda there. So it was before the Charlie Hebdo attacks, so before 2015, before we started to talk a lot about it. And I ended up meeting 100 jihadists, both in France, Belgium, and in prison through one-on-one interviews. My questions back then were very basics. They were like, how come we started with a few dozens jihadists implemented in Europe in the 1990s, and London, through the so-called London stand, was one of these hubs, and ended up with 6,000 European joining ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which basically means we multiply the number of jihadists in Europe by 100 over 2 decades. So what is at stake here? And my first answer to that, again very basic, was that we tend to focus too much on the terrorism aspect to jihadism, while it's and I'm sitting next to the guy who wrote the book, The History of an Idea, Salafo Jihadism. Well, that's an ideology, is something that can be spread, that can convert people, that can attract, that have an appeal, that has an appeal. And so I try to focus on what is jihadism outside of terrorism. Everything but attacks. I consider the attacks as the end of the movie, the last 2 minutes of the movies. And I try to focus on the entire movie with full subtitles if possible. And I ended up realizing that there is a European pattern of jihadism, because if you look at just the numbers, these 6,000 Europeans who got involved in jihadi groups in Syria and Iraq, they came from 8 countries. 85% of them were coming from 8 European countries. So, for instance, France was by far the prime, exporter, so to say, of jihadists, with 2,000 French people involved in Syria and Iraq. Then the UK and Germany was about 1,000. Then we have Belgium, the very small Belgium with 600 people. Then the Netherlands, around 300. We have Denmark with about 200, a little bit less than 200. Sweden, around 200 as well. And then Austria, if we want to add one more. So for instance, Italy, 11 people, 11 Italian national involved in ISIS or Al-Qaeda or in Syria and Iraq. So there is something that is happening in France that is not happening in Italy, for instance, or the opposite if you prefer. So my question was, what is happening there? And I realized that there is a clear geography within each country that I've mentioned. In France, the UK, Belgium, Germany, you name it, all these countries, you have hubs, you have clusters that are like sort of over exemplified by or over that are producing the most people. Like France, you have 15 places, 15 cities that produce 95% of all the jihadists who ended up in Syria and Iraq. You've got the same in the UK, it's about 20 places, in Germany it's about 1,000, in Belgium it's about 40. So you have these very clear geographical hubs. And if we zoom in these cities, you will find very concrete neighborhoods where you have people who are joining ISIS, and this other neighborhood in very same cities where you have nothing's happening. So why do you have this geography? I ended up realizing it's not the poorest place in Europe or in these countries, or not even the poorest neighborhood of these cities. It's not the places where you have the most discrimination or the most political or cultural marginalization phenomenon. It's not as well places where you have the biggest proportion of Muslims. It's not this. So the public debate in Europe, which tends to either bumped on the one hand saying these are rebels fighting against oppression or some form of marginalization is not correct. It's factually incorrect. But also the other position that says we have a problem with immigration and Muslims is not correct either, because you have places like Marseille, where in the north neighborhood of Marseille you have 300,000 Muslims around-ish, and a lot of problems, socially, drug trafficking and everything, and yet you have no one who ended up joining ISIS. Yes, you have Lunel, which is a very small town, like middle class, nothing at all compared to Marseille, and you have 25 people who joined ISIS for a population of 20,000 people. So what is happening in Lunel that is not happening in Marseille? It cannot be explained through socio-economic and political argument. You need to dive into this geography and understand what has happened there that is not happening. And the straight answer to that is that behind this geography, very specific geography of European jihadism, you have a clear history, and it's about the same all over and over. It's people who, from the 1990s onward, were veterans of Afghanistan or of the Algerian jihad, or sometimes other places from sometimes Egypt, but Afghanistan and Algeria played a big role in this, who settled in Europe. And when they settled in one place, they started spreading the ideology, they started preaching. And this was non-violent, this was not terrorism, it was just like they were building up schools, they were building up evening seminars, they were setting up NGOs, they were setting up stands selling products on the city market, stuff like that, that enabled them to spread their ideology. So you can take one of them, put him in prison because he ended up in a terror cell. If he trained like 20 people, you will have to handle these 20 people who will then they will take over and they will spread their ideology even more. And so that's what happened. That's how we ended up with a few thousands of veterans from Afghanistan and Algeria to up to 6,000 in Europe. It's because there were these networks spreading the ideology low under the radar with low noise and not actually most of the time falling into terror prompt. So that's one aspect. If you look then at a second aspect of the European pattern is like you have waves. That's an article I actually wrote for GWD Program on Extremism, which called Ebbs and Flows of European Jihadism. If you look at what happened over the last 3 decades you have one full cycle of ebb and flows of European jihadism, and every decade so far, it has been more powerful. So in the 1990s, the peak of the high tide was in the mid-1990s. It was in France, after the GIA attacks in Paris and the global declaration of jihad from Bin Laden. Then you have a low tide moment. Then after 9/11, you start to have again a high tide moment in the mid-2000s with the war in Iraq and the jihad in Iraq, and that's it's manifested itself through terror attacks in the UK with 7/7, in Madrid with the 2004 attacks, through the killing of Theo Bamberg in the Netherlands at the same time, and then the cartoon affair in Denmark. Then with the destruction of the Islamic State, of the so-called Islamic State of Iraq, in the late 2000s, you start to have again a low moment. All the terror cells are incarcerated in Europe, so they are unable to to fight back or to organize or project new terror plots. But then you have, after the the beginning of the end of Syria, after the Arab Spring, you start to have jihadists taking roots in Syria and Iraq, sometimes most of the time from Iraq, and you end up with ISIS, which is the last big wave, the last big high tide moment, which of course translates through all the terror campaign that you guys know about from 2014 onward to 2019 onward. And thanks to the work of the coalition, Daesh was destroyed, military speaking, terror plots were thwarted and arrested once again, and we're back on a low tide since then. The question is, what is it happening now and where it is going? So first, for the first time, we have a very large number of jihadi militants who are born and raised European, which is what we call homegrown or indigenous jihadism. This is something to consider when we're talking about how we can respond to that. Second aspect, we have several places, Shiraz mentioned a few, including the prisons, where recruitment and preaching is happening on a daily basis. But we also have a new methods of widespread preaching, which is of course online and using AI to enhance the development of this. Hence my reflection to how we can, I know how to do field work in the real world, but how do we do field work online? You need tools, so you need to talk to engineers. You need to develop these tools, and that's what we started to develop with our camp. So where is it going now? I see a few lines that I will present for debate, and also maybe a few angles for solutions, because I think it's very important. One is what is happening now in terms, are we still in a low tide mode, or are we back in a high tide moment? It's honestly, it's open to debate. I will say, I know that Peter Newman published a very interesting article 2 weeks ago saying that considering the number of attacks or attempted attack in Western Europe, we might say we're back on a high tide. Because in 2024 only, the level of attempted attacks, terrorist attack from jihadists, was multiplied by 5. Most of them were thwarted, thank God. So we are in a situation where the threat is contained because of the security response to it, but the number shows that we're on a rise again. 1/3 of these attacks, by the way, were targeting Jewish targets, which is important because it shows the context in Gaza, and the post-October 7 context is playing a big role. Second, there is these 3 places that you presented very well, which is the return of ISK, which basically has European networks, especially because Syrian networks ended up there and sort of bonded with other Caucasian and Central Asian networks who are operating in Europe. So that's one thing. You have, of course, Sub-Saharan Africa networks who are still somehow disconnected to Europe, but we should absolutely be careful with that, because once the connection is made, we will have a different problem of a different magnitude. And the third place, which is of course the biggest concern for me at the moment, is Syria and Iraq. These places that we started to address with is the destruction of ISIS. Because if you look at what is there, there is nothing that is actually very settled. Like, there is so much military means that are on the ground that the situation is sort of under control, because you have every power you can imagine in the region. You've got US troops, you've got Turkish troops, you've got Kurdish troops, you've got Iranian militias, you've got, of course, Syrian forces, you've got Shia militias everywhere, you name it, you've got all of them, ISIS or Al-Qaeda groups operating there. So if it's not moving so fast, it's because there is a lot of pressure on this front. Yet, with the war in Lebanon actually, and the dismantlement of Hezbollah, they might, even, and they actually maybe are doing it right now, recall or call back some of their Hezbollah allied troops or special forces that were in northern Syria, and they might, call them back to fight on the southern front with Israel. So you will open a gate that might be, or a vacuum that might be filled. We should remember that as much as Hezbollah is an enemy of Israel, it's also an enemy of ISIS. It was the force that prevented ISIS to take control of several cities in Lebanon. It was the forces that fight very strongly in underground corridors in Raqqa. And so with the weakening of Hezbollah, which is a good or bad, thing for, no matter, regardless of your approach of the conflict, the weakening of Hezbollah will open a door that might be filled by ISIS or by Daesh or other forces. So we should look at this. Last but not least, what can we do in terms of preventing the ideology to spread? I think we should absolutely develop a grand reflection about AI, because I'll take a concrete example. Now social networks, they are able to, take away or take down a video of ISIS, of Daesh, like beheading someone, all right? They are able to do that because they have the algorithm that detects it very rapidly. But we know that, and everybody who works on this online, you are aware that jihadi groups, they tend to change a little bit their narrative to downplay the more violent and more explicit aspect of their ideology, to underline the more ideological components of it, so that the algorithm is not taking down this content. So you have actually a lot of jihadi ideology that is spread through TikTok, through Instagram, or of course Telegrams and other Twitter-like platforms. So what we can do very easily, we take all the propaganda of these groups, we train AI models, and we start to show that when we have narratives that are similar up to X%, maybe 70% or 80%, with that of these jihadi groups, it might not be illegal in terms of the law, but it is very problematic politically, socially, and for the social cohesion. So we might act on this, and we might be able to show to social network platforms that these groups should at least not be pushed forward by algorithm, and maybe they should be be downgraded by algorithm. So that's one example. There is so many of these to show that there is plenty room to act on this ideological level, on preventing and slowing down the spread of this ideology in a context that, of course, needs special attention, especially in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think a very important thing from what you mentioned is the narrative. And my next question is to Her Excellency Sheikh Al-Ahmed. Daesh exploited Islam in our region. They exploited grievances. They have the advantage of the language, and they knew how to target audience. I have seen myself in the middle of Mosul, as young as 12 to 13 years, being impressed by what they have seen by Daesh. It's very appealing, the narrative is very compelling, and they would join the terrorist organization. 10 years after that, we attempted to understand why this happened. We attempted to understand why such narrative might appeal to some groups. And the responsibility also of the Arab and Muslim countries is very important. It's immense. 10 years after that, do we understand that narrative? Are we still fighting on the narrative front? Because definitely Daesh also was selling the illusion that we are alternative, the illusion that we can provide you with what the others can't. Many people did believe that for multiple reasons. But did we take control back of the narrative? I mean, do we have it?
As someone from Bahrain, and it's a country in the region, I think the conflicts around us and the people are starting to know the threat of extremism. Like in Saudi Arabia, they have the Sawab rehabilitation program. In UAE, they have I'tidal. And for us, we are an active member with the global coalition against Daesh. I think we are still working, and as Martin said, the threat is still there. And some people think that Daesh is over. I don't think it is over. I think the threat is still there, and even though the accomplishment is great, but I think it's important to keep working together, and especially with the sharing information, I think it's crucial. And the financial part of the support of Daesh, the financial network, I think for us, we realize how this is one of their most important tools they use to recruit people. One of the Bahraini Daesh recruits, actually, we know he called his father and offered his father in Bahrain $100,000 just after joining Daesh in a couple of weeks. So how they recruit new people, I think they use money and women. We have to realize what is the causes and how they recruit people. And with social media now, I think it's becoming more dangerous. It's easier for them to approach different people. And Shiraz mentioned the refugee camps.
Yes.
And I think for us, we think it is a clicking bomb, like, especially because most of it is women and children. And the children are under 12 years old. And the nationalities of the wives of the Daesh members, some of them are Iraqis and Syrians, and actually from 51 other countries. Some of them are from European countries. And even the governments, the European governments, they are reluctant to repatriate them, which is, I think, understandable, because authorities, they cannot decide whether the wives are actually a victim or perpetrators. So I think it's not only about men, even Daesh members. I think we have to also take into account the women, because they are the ones who's going to raise the children. I think this part is we have to do a lot before, and be proactive before it's actually exploded.
Thank you. Martin, I recall from previous conversations we had, whether in conferences or discussions, it's something related to the task, because military is very important. It was required. There was a heavy cost in some areas, but it was necessary. But 10 years after the formation of the coalition, which includes many countries, the battle beyond the battlefield is the battle to make Daesh irrelevant. Did we at least succeed in making them irrelevant? Despite the concern, and all of you highlighted that the risk of terrorism is still there. It's Daesh or a different version of Daesh or whatever might come out of that period. Do we control, or do we have the ability to make Daesh relevant in communities? For example, in what Yuba mentioned, there are certain areas where people might find terrorism appealing. There are areas where terrorism can grow. There are areas where there are legitimate grievances.
Well, I think we have been able collectively to make Daesh less relevant, but it is definitely still too relevant in Iraq and Syria. I don't know about Afghanistan, but increasingly relevant in Southern and Central Asian countries and pockets of Europe, and depressingly in large areas of Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahel and so on and so on. Why might that be the case? Well, I'm going to go back to what Shiraz said about ideology of vulnerable Sunni and vulnerable Sunni core. I mean, it's not possible to say there's one reason for Daesh having grown, but if there is one reason for Daesh to have grown, it is, in my view, a question of deprivation, socioeconomic deprivation, political deprivation, livelihood deprivation, poor governance, poor human rights, etc., etc. And wherever you see that, and there's a lot of it around the world, Daesh and others are very capable, I'm afraid, of exploiting that, throwing an ideological element to it, demonstrating how grievance has got something to do with jihad and Islamic faith and so on and so on, displacement, a lack of belonging by individuals, and so on. I think the list is quite long and established. And until we bear down on those, what are often called driving forces, sufficiently, into a sufficient number of places, international terrorism, whether it's got an Islamic State or Daesh label on it, or Al-Qaeda or Jadin or Al-Shabaab, will remain. So I think it's a constant. The question is how far you can, as I often say, squeeze it, not completely out of the system, because I think that's a bit like saying how do you get rid of global poverty or aversion of. But if you can squeeze it sufficiently, it becomes less relevant and more manageable. Like many other things that we have to manage on a growing basis, whether it be poverty, deprivation, abuse, crime, drug abuse, you name it, we've got to try and get it to that level. But will we ever make it irrelevant? I'm afraid not. I think not. I mean, history tells us that that's the case. No reason to think that we will get rid of terrorism, because it is as old as us, as old as our civilization, our culture, our history, our relationships. Conflict. It's a version of conflict. Sorry, that's not a very positive answer.
Yeah,
but I think it might be a more realistic one.
I think to what you say, Martin, and also the coalition, the global coalition, how it was formed, some might see that it was not immediately enforcing its combat. It took some time before Daesh was defeated, for multiple reasons. But there are questions now with, for example, the director of MI5 saying that a huge percentage of their investigations are involving rise in terrorism activities related to Al-Qaeda and Daesh across the world. But people might ask, in case something like Daesh might emerge again, are we prepared to immediately respond?
I think, by the way, the reference that you make is to Dan's speech on the 8th of October, so which is online. It is a very good read, so I do encourage people to look for the DG of MI5 speech on that day. I think, as I hinted in what I said earlier, we're better prepared, but this is a long, long game. The bad guys are very clear that this is a lifelong struggle. There's no doubt about that in their minds, and if we are going to counter it to a sufficient extent and keep it sufficiently under control, sufficiently relevant, we have to have as much strategic patience as them. And that is very, very difficult. There are plenty of reasons why that is difficult. including all of us, move around in our minds and in our needs and in our wants and our priorities all the time. And to ask somebody to have the same set of priorities as individuals, as electorates, as governments, 10 years after we faced Daesh, it's a very big ask, it's a very big challenge. But that's one of the challenges that the community that works on the countering of Daesh and related issues has to tackle. How do you compete for the attention that is absolutely required to face down most eminently, as far as Europe is concerned, and others, and freedom and sovereignty and all of those very big issues to face down the situation that we have in Ukraine. I mean, you do get to a point, certainly in government, but in our own minds, I mean, how much time do we spend on that issue as opposed to that issue, as opposed to this new issue that has just arisen, and so on and so on. Life keeps moving and generally creates new problems all the time to tackle, whether you are governments or individuals or societies, and that's tough. And amidst all of this, somehow we've got to maintain the pressure on those who devote their lives every day and all of their lives to being bad actors for the benefit of terrorist organizations. I'm not giving a very upbeat but that's a bit of a reflection, I think, of a reality that we all face.
Yeah. Before I go, Sergio, the floor is open if you would like to ask any question. Please state your name and affiliation in 5 minutes after Sergio, and I will get back to you. The question, Sergio, is how advanced is our academic research in understanding extremism, terrorism? Are we able now to deconstruct the ideologies, to understand them more, in more social, ideological, and much more importantly, in the differentiation between violent extremism and non-violent extremism, what is legitimate and what is not?
Well, it's a very intelligent and difficult question to answer at the same time. Sorry. I think Dr. Malegu mentioned before that we've made some progress. Some of the institutions present today in this table and other institutions globally. The thing is, there's always a long path ahead, just like Mr. Ward mentioned. I mean, there's achievements, and there's new paths that are open in which progress can be made. When it comes to violent and non-violent extremism, I think it's interesting to mention that I know narratives and building narratives has become kind of a fashionable part of our terminology. Do we understand exactly what building a narrative or strategic narratives mean? I mean, at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, 80 to 85% of a jihadi terrorist organization suits perfectly the understanding of the world of a regular Muslim. So it becomes very tricky and very advanced to disentangle their narratives, and then part of his narratives that do not or are not consistent with humanistic, with a proper and widely spread, cross-cutting spread version of Islam that most Muslims share. That's why the developing of AI-powered, computer-powered tools that allow us to master huge amounts of data in short time, it's not only timely, but it's necessary. We need to approach, let's say, a corpus of propaganda, of posts online very fast, and be able to, let's say, to differentiate what's legitimate and what's not, what's can be considered extremism but is within the framework of law, and what is going to drive other persons into violent extremism or these kinds of behavior. That's why I honestly and humbly believe there's not only a road to be followed. This is a problem that will be here with us, and we have to to master the height of the waves when they come. There's definitely progress that can be made joining the knowledge that we already have from, in this case, Islamist, extremist, jihadi organizations, and technology as it comes and as it makes progress together with us. It's not just let's say applying a classic qualitative approach to things, because the amount of data, of information that is shared just in 1 second does not always allow for a qualitative and well-based explanation of things. Sometimes we have to use mixing methods, sometimes we just need numbers to provide decision makers, to provide policy makers with statistics upon which they can make informed decisions. And I think that's where the challenge really relies now, enjoying a bit more, not only academia and policy makers and civil servants, etc., but also qualitative and quantitative to take more informed decisions.
Thank you, Sergio. I apologize. I have another question, and then we'll get back to others. I think two officials here. It's a very important question related to the ability of creating a combination of policy making and research, academia and government, as two people from two member states in the coalition. Are governments learning, benefiting, looking into the research that was produced in the past decades to learn and inform their policy?
Well, I'm going to say I think so, I hope so. Certainly as far as the team that I work in, many of them are here, so they kind of illustrate the point. We make a point of staying connected with people outside our immediate environment, because if we don't, you just very quickly disappear into your own silo, into your own thinking, into your own echo chamber, or whatever it is. And although government, the British government for sure, has very, very great resources and capable people who are analysing the problem all the time, why on earth wouldn't we go beyond government to dip into and draw upon and learn from those great institutions like this one that I attended a few years ago. Although actually I was based in NSC, I just have to say that for any King's student in the room. And George Washington University, etc. Sorry about that, should we say. Washington University and many, many others. That's just a given. It is not so straightforward to actually do it in practice because the day job, we all have ambitions to be while we're going, etc., etc. Sometimes the day job and the immediate requirement to get that brief to the minister, explain that or whatever it is, gets in the way. But that's partly why we're here today, because we have a constant wish to stay fresh in our thinking, so that the work that we do is better informed than otherwise.
I agree with Martin, 100%, and I think there is still a room to improve. But for our region, the think tanks is not a sector that is as well established as in Europe or in the UK. As we talked before the panel, you mentioned that we want to look for future solutions. So I really agree, and I think that this is something we can work on to include the centers and the research, the academia, in finding solutions. I think that will be very, very helpful and something we can start an initiative from here.
Thank you.
I'm Alex Carlisle. I was independent reviewer of terrorism legislation for the UK for 10.5 years from 9/11. I'm involved in a geopolitical consultancy and I'm a member of the House of Lords. Two questions, if I may. We've heard well-evidenced praise for the work of the coalition, some of it from people who have been heavily involved in that work. But my recollection of the behaviour of President Trump when he was President of the United States in relation to Iraq and Syria was that his statements were generally either incomprehensible or very contradictory. how much optimism do you have for the future of the coalition if President Trump becomes president? Or putting it another way, how will we be able to continue this work if there is that kind of attrition? My second question is completely different, and it's related to Hugo Micheron's excellent presentation, in which you referred to the number of people who've become jihadists from different countries in Europe. And I'd like you to just, or others, to just give us an idea of what we can do about that. Are we making mistakes? For example, by locking up 83,000 men in prison, proportionately far more than in other countries, prison being the most boring place on earth. Are we actually creating circumstances in which people are too easily radicalized? Should we? I wrote a report on the definition of terrorism in UK law about 20 years ago. Should we change the definition of UK law? I notice that Bahrain has a much wider definition of terrorism than the UK, which would include some activities which we here would probably not regard as political at all. Or should we be dealing with the internet by being much more active in restricting the activities of internet service providers, including, for example, groups that monetize advertisements? One I can name, Channel 3 Now, based in Pakistan, which take radicalizing content and simply sell it for money. Should we be doing more about that, and do we need to be much more robust in how we deal with the internet in policy making?
Thank you.
Martin,
Thank you very much. I refer the right honourable gentleman to the comment I made earlier on about this is a personal response. Trump. I was in Iraq the morning that we saw his tweet to say that coalition forces would be removed out of Syria, and on that particular day I had my weekly coordination meeting with coalition forces at a particular location, and it was one of the most sobering meetings I have attended in a while, but in the way that good civil servants and good military people do, they got on with it. Of course, they were being told, in some cases, if they were US, by their commander-in-chief, their new orders were as follows. But they're not stupid people. They know what the consequences of that order was going to be. So the next few weeks and months saw something that is not terribly well known, but it is public knowledge that actually there was a rebalancing of that decision. And the conclusion a number of weeks and months later was, with President Trump's approval, was that forces would be reduced, but they would not be withdrawn, as he had suggested in his initial tweet. So it wasn't as bad as it looked, put it that way. What might it look like after the 4th of November? I do not know. Certainly continues to send signals that make our lives as officials a little more difficult, let me put it that way. To a certain extent, less about what we're talking about here, more about circumstances in Ukraine and Europe. In the United States, I think over the last few, let me just end with the thought that over the last few weeks and months, the United States homeland has become much more aware of the threat of Daesh, in particular ISKP. This is all, again, public knowledge. Certain people have been detained, certain plots have perhaps been disrupted. So if you are seeking to make America great again or safer again, maybe that is something that you focus on a little more than you thought you had to. Whereas something in that distant place called Europe, where the Europeans just don't devote enough resource to defending themselves, might suffer a little bit more.
Well, I guess we will have to wait until November the 5th. So,
I suspect a bit longer than that.
you go.
Thank you, sir, for your question. When I I realized something that changed completely my appreciation of jihadism in Europe. It's like most of the time it is presented in conversation as a phenomenon that is happening very rapidly, almost to anyone, and most of the time online. And when I conducted my research all across Europe, I realized it was actually quite the opposite. Jihadism developed very slowly over 30 years' time in very specific human environments, namely those where these veterans implemented themselves and developed their preaching. And you know, sometimes it worked, and sometimes they were chased out of this environment. There is so many stories, and it's understood the phenomenon where preacher and jihadist ideologues settled in one area, in France, the UK, Germany, Belgium, you name it, and were chased out, and they ended up in another country. There is so many stories like this, and it's not very well covered. And the third thing is, it most of the time happen in the physical world. So this means if it took 30 years to build up, it will take maybe a generation or so to dismantle. I think we should look for long term, and we should seek for where are the main areas, so the clusters, physical clusters and online clusters. And for this, we have to sort of reinforce the immune system of the communities and of the societies. And we cannot do that without addressing the religious aspect of it and the political aspect of it. There are political and religious actors. And in Europe, sometimes it's difficult to think that way, but that's what they are. You know, you cannot completely iron out the political aspects of their ideology and of their appeal, and you cannot iron out the religious aspect of the ideology that is very powerful and attractive as well. So at some point we'll have to look at, you know, who is legitimate for defining what's the limit of an identity, because jihadists are very good at it. They say this is what is right, this is what is wrong, this is what is a Muslim, this is what is not a Muslim. And this is, you know, when you're looking for a clear answer, this is a clear answer. It's a very extreme one, but it can work. So we should invest, I think, a lot of energy in that direction in Europe, because for good or bad reasons, we're not considering that because, you know, this is a religious matter, we don't want to look into what is happening in Muslim communities. And you will have very clear distinction between what is happening in Muslim communities in Molenbeek, Brussels, and what is happening in Muslim communities, you know, elsewhere in Belgium. It's not the same communities, stuff that are happening within the first one is not happening in the later. And so we will be able to be very precise and basically provide a diagnostic, and then based on this act. Last two things, prisons, you know, and I completely share Shiraz's remarks about Al-Hol. To a lot of extent, if you look at least what European jihadists have been doing in Syria, they were there to gather and organize what they call an Islamic State, at least to gather and, you know, have some sort of sovereignty over land. You can do that in a prison if you control the prison. You know? You can do that in Al-Hol if you control Al-Hol, which is exactly what is happening there. In prison in France, that I spent like 3 years, you know, back and forth interviewing jihadists there. The first step they try to do is to control the social space of the prison, you know, to gather them. And so, you know, there is so many things that comes from this. It's like, how do you punish a jihadist if you put him in a prison where he actually has a room for maneuvering, recruiting, and maybe learning and, you know, teaching himself or others. The third stuff is school. Institutions, you know, they are developing a very strong, narrative, very strong narratives about education systems in Europe, because they consider this is, you know, untried. This is like ideological content that we provide to kids in Europe, you know. So we have to look at this, you know. They sort of like consider themselves as a counter society. In France, schools have been targeted several times by jihadists. It means something. It's also a sign that now terrorist perpetrators are younger and younger. You know, in Europe, they are like teenage, 13, 14 years old, are on the rise in terms of involvement in attacks. So last aspect, internet. That's exactly one place where Europe is lacking. Europe and the UK, of course, are lacking of sovereignty. Europe, the EU plus UK, is the biggest digital space in the world. It's 1.5 the size of the US. So it means that Europeans and British are using on a daily basis way more social media than anywhere else in the world. Yet, there is no European social network. So we're in a position of extreme vulnerabilities, and I think this is time to think about social networks not as a platform where public debate is happening, but as a jungle where the one who has the strongest algorithm or the strongest troll army will win. And so this, if we want to start like cleaning up the mess and slowing down the spread of extremist content, be them jihadists, you name them, like white supremacists, you name them, we will have to get control back over the algorithm, and this is under the power of law. We just need a lot of political will.
Thank you, Hugo. Please. Yeah.
Thank
Please
you.
make it brief.
I'll be super brief. My name's Sam Godson. I'm a former FCD OCT department, also former King's War Studies, so it's nice to be at home. Thank you to a wonderful panel for all of your comments. I'll be super quick. So the agreement to withdraw the coalition from Iraq by September next year, I'm interested in the panel's view on that.
We're not withdrawing. That's
Okay,
the first point.
okay, well, great. And secondly, so I, like Martin and others, would be part of what was a kind of CT industry which grew up over from 2001 onwards, and in effect we built capability and expertise and identity, and we classed a lot of groups which were potentially militias and insurgencies and social movements and political parties who were also somewhat terrorist related, and we classed them fundamentally as terrorist groups because that was the thing that we cared about the most. In order to kind of not be fighting the last war, what do you think we might need to change in terms of viewing these insurgencies and groups in places like sub-Saharan Africa, not purely through a CT lens?
First of all, we are not withdrawing. That's a really crucial point. It's not just about language, though it is. We are transitioning, and that's not clever language. This is about how you manage over time the threat down so that you are in a circumstance where you have built up capability of indigenous forces to manage it, and that will take time. So please don't imagine that suddenly we're going to up and leave. Thank you for giving me the chance to say that. I think I will go to, my quick answer is we need to go to the whole of government approach. We need to continue to, as we often say, keep cutting the grass in the kinetic way or the security-focused way that we do, because we are faced with a kinetic threat that seeks to kill people, and our job is, as every government's job is by law, to protect national security and so on and so on. But we have to do something about the weeds to ensure that the grass doesn't just keep on growing, because we're already forever cutting it. So that requires a much fuller integration, as I mentioned it, of resource, policy, attitude, culture, blah, 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 so that you squeeze out the reasons for people wanting to become extreme in their behavior, then violently extreme, and then ultimately tip of the iceberg, as it were, become terrorists.
Thank you, Mark. Please make it brief. We have only 5 minutes left.
Sure. My name is Harry Holcroft. I'm the Head of Business Development and Partnerships at IN2. And my question is, first of all, thank you for a very engaging discussion. My question is primarily, again, for Martin, but also for the wider panel. And it's about interventions in the programming space. We've come a long way in our evolution and our thinking about what works on the ground. We started with working with formers, we've worked on counter-ideology messaging, alternative messages, critical thinking, etc. And at this 10-year inflection point, I wonder where the cell's thinking is on where our best successes have been in programming and interventions, recognizing that we obviously tailor these for local audiences in different geographies. But there must be learnings on what works and what doesn't. And that's the question.
I'll be really quick. Well, in Iraq, Syria, and in particular in Iraq, and you'd be very pleased to hear this in northern Iraq, and now the work that we are doing with respect to the camps. So in northern Iraq, it's about turning a terrorism problem into a violent extremist problem into then an extremist problem, and then perhaps a societal problem. It's a sort of continue in the reverse direction with which Daesh wants life to go. but that requires a lot of persistence to get to that point where it can be managed indigenously. And in the camps are terrible, there's no doubt about it. But there is progress there. You know, in 2017 or 19, there were 90,000 people in Al Hol. There are now 39,930 people in Al Hol. Why do I know that? Because we work very closely on the repatriation, the rehabilitation and reintegration of those folk. And that is becoming I'm reluctant to call it a success story, but less of a disaster, put it that way. Great praise for the government of Iraq and ourselves for being part of that, and the coalition to move an awful lot of Iraqis out, move a fair number of Syrians out, a good number of third country nationals. But somebody mentioned earlier on that we are facing circumstances in which there are some people, particularly Syrians, who would prefer to stay in Al Hol than go back to Syria. Over the last few weeks and months, we've absolutely seen that dynamic. That's shocking. I mean, that's a real indictment. And that's not about to change anytime soon, because whereas Iraq is an increasingly stable place, secure place, etc., there's absolutely no doubt about that. Syria is not. So if you are a Syrian in Al Hol, it's a nightmare. But what is outside awaiting you? It's a really difficult choice for them to make. But at least they have increasingly the option to make it.
Omar, just quickly, there's no immediate need to get out of the room. I know there's a lot of questions, but sort of like time, so we can run over a little bit. If people need to go, get away, feel free to, but I don't want to cut off.
I mean, we have 3 to 4 minutes. I think I'm going to take only one final tiny question.
Just take the remaining questions. So we run over.
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm one of the analysts at Counter-Terrorism Policing HQ. And I just wondered, there's a really quick question. Do you think the increase in English language or kind of Western media language publications from ISKP will translate into violence in the West?
I think it is. Anybody who has met those who commit these crimes, certainly me personally, I'm always struck at how bad their Arabic is, and I've met quite a few of them. So the more, I really worry about ISKB's linguistic capability, which is to a certain extent IA based. I think it's either 11 or 12 languages now. Nobody has done that before. I mean, I think it's fair to say that Daesh, somebody touched upon it earlier, Daesh became the masters of social media in terms of terrorism over the last 10 years. The thing that we've got to worry about now is the extent to which somebody, ISKP, becomes the masters of IA. It's beginning, it's not as bad as it could be, but it's beginning. And it could just become more efficient in the same way as we will use AI to write some of our speeches, and I hope not our essays, or our analysis, and I hit upon
Turn it in, we'll get you.
They will do the same. They are doing the same already. Why wouldn't they? You just become more efficient, and that means speaking to more people more easily, got more time in the day to do other things. So I think it's beginning, I'm afraid.
Probably another question. Please.
Lauren Shackley, HMG. Thank you, everyone. It's been really interesting. Shiraz, you mentioned that kind of any diminishing of US or coalition presence will have a serious impact. I think that's an agreed judgment quite widely. We've also talked about the transition of the coalition. Assuming that we don't have any drastic changes because of the US elections, so just parking that bit to the side, if during this transition period, where do you think the coalition and its members should focus their efforts in the North East and more widely to ensure we minimise the impact of any transition or eventual departure that there may be given a US decision?
Big question. Look, if we're talking specifically in the context of the North East, one of the things I think that we've been looking at in the context of the Track 2 dialogues that we've been running is that the coalition should have specific people whose job it is to liaise in a purely political agreement with the IDF and third-party countries in order to facilitate those repatriations, to build that buffer as well in the way that the SDF, for all of the praise they get, are still a self-interested actor on the ground with their own objectives, and of course there is a value in retaining a certain number of foreign country nationals in order for their own political either bargaining, but also for financial gain sometimes, for diplomatic gain and so on. So that's been one of the recommendations which I think has been quite important in some of these discussions, is to have that sort of neutral third-party interlocutor essentially, which negotiates with the SDF on behalf of the coalition, if you're, let's say, the Dutch government, the Belgian government, or whoever it is trying to get the people out. And that's, again, born of specific criticism, concerns we've had raised in those forums by some of those countries who are saying we're being put in a very difficult situation by the SDF because they want X, and we can't do that in order to get our people. So I think that's one really obvious, tangible thing that could come out. I think there's broader things as well, encouraging more Arab participation in the SDF. Again, there's a huge ethnic component to this. We've been talking, about the fact that there is a sectarian element, there's an ethnic element, there's all these different things. None of them are in and of themselves the defining factor, the exclusive factor. There are lots of pro-regime Sunnis, for example, who stayed with Bashar al-Assad, right? So we're saying it's the vulnerable Sunni people, for example, who have been exploited in Raqqa, for example. So again, there is a lot of animus, fear, suspicion of the ethnic composition of the SDF and its leadership being a primarily Kurdish entity, and again, Arabs will have to be involved in that process, be along in that process. Again, so working on some of these tangible things, I think two obvious first steps that you can take in order to mitigate what might happen and what might be coming down the road in a few weeks with the US. Oh, I'll just make one very fine point. It's unrelated, actually. Let's go back to the point Lord Carlisle was making, a few people were saying. I also touched on it, which is, we were talking about the internet a little bit in this Q&A session. ISIS was, as we said, they were quick, they developed, they understood social media the way that AQ did. AQ was sort of old era of operating on chat forums, now we're here. We are moving away from even the traditional social media of YouTube and these kinds of places. To the extent that if you and I upload an ISIS propaganda video on YouTube, it will probably go down before it goes up. They have the algorithms for being replaced. But we're going to an era of decentralized social media, of blockchain social media. Once it goes there, if I upload the collective works of Anwar Awlaki onto the blockchain, you can't really go and take it down. That's the nature of these decentralized platforms. Then the challenge becomes how you stop people finding it. But again, I fear governments tend to be flat-footed, to be slow in response to these types of things. There will be, again, a sort of crest of this wave where the next generation of digital natives are finding it, before we're finding it, before we're then understanding it, before we're then able to combat it. We will get there, but that crest is also there.
Thank you, Shiraz. You will probably briefly, because what he mentioned is the future direction of combating terrorism. It might not be any longer on the ground, it's online. How can AI be leveraged on this front?
I don't know for English-speaking content, but for the first time late last spring, so I guess it was April 2024, we noticed the first AI-powered and produced Daesh video for like French speaker. So basically it was 100% AI powered. It was like an LLM, right? A large language model that produced it. So it was uploaded, it was detected, but it's a clear sign that that's the way they're going. And of course the possibilities are limitless, exactly the same as the revolution we noticed. One example is given by Mustafa Suleyman, who was based here, was one of the co-founder of DeepMind. Now he's, I guess, the chief AI at Google. And in his book, which is called The Coming Wave, he gave a very compelling example that what might be jihadism in the new era. He says, well, you can have someone who takes all the sermons from Anwar el-Awlaki and he uploads it online. He trains a model, and then the model learns from your data, learns from your info, and it starts talking to you in your own dialect, spotting the weak spot in your personality or the grievances he can maybe instrumentalize or weaponize against you, so that you turn into, being manipulated by a bot. It's not that far away. It's not that stupid. So, what I think we should absolutely do is to start thinking the technology, to approach technologies through the political lens. It's not something that we should let on the side in the hand of engineers. We should absolutely consider that the evolution of technology is a political issue that should be discussed wider by the society, and of course it's a matter that should be addressed by researchers as well, especially on this field.
Hugo, thank you. Many thanks to all the panelists for their contributions, and many thanks to our audience. This is not the end of our presentation. There will be more discussions in the future. Thank you again for coming. And